I mean, at some point my furnace could kick on as well, but you're probably not going to hear that either. All right. Well, I'm going to do just the little intro-y bits, and then we can dive right into the topic. Okay, so funnily enough, I did hear all that, though. That's amusing.
Good to know. Good to know. Oh, it shouldn't happen again here while we're chatting.
No worries. No worries.
You can also, the space bar is a shortcut for mute and unmute.
Ah, yes. Push to talk. Welcome back to OT After Hours, a podcast about industrial cybersecurity, why it matters, and all of the challenges that it presents. Before we dive into topic, we should probably go around and introduce ourselves. We actually do have one new voice on the podcast, so I'm going to, again, break with my tradition of going left to right across my screen and invite Zach to introduce himself first. Zach, hello.
Hey, so I'm Zachary Woltjer. I am a cyber data analyst on our customer success team here at Verve, which is just a really complicated way of saying that I'm kind of a liaison of sorts, I guess. Any customer comes to us, asks us all sorts of questions, and we try to, help put the puzzle piece together.
Absolutely. The CS group does a lot of heavy lifting of making all the data make sense. And back with us again is Lance Lamont. Hello, Lance. How you doing this week?
Hi, everybody. Doing really well. How about yourself?
Cannot complain. Summer's coming to a close.
It is.
And I'm Ken Kully, Verve System Support Lead and host of OT After Hours. And this episode was actually, so we had Sally on the last episode, and this episode was kind of partly her brainchild, and of course, partly Zach's brainchild, because Zach recently did some presentations on, and I believe was the author of a blog post and a white paper on what we call a calculated risk rating, which is actually like in reading up on in reading your white paper, your blog post, Zach, it struck me that this is like super, super relevant. And I think I might have alluded to it in the previous episode in the little chat that I had with Sally as well. But this was actually like super, super relevant to a client that we were doing a proof of concept for. But I'm probably getting ahead of myself. So let's start at the best place to start, which is at the beginning. And when we talk about a calculated risk rating, like that's a mouthful of a term. So what does that actually mean?
So this kind of the calculated risk rating, or CRR as I like to call it, it really came from a single question that we got from a customer. They were looking at their assets, they were looking at their vulnerabilities, and they simply said, look, this is all great information, but it's not tailored to us. It's kind of a puffy jacket, if you will. They were hoping for a little bit of tailoring to them so that it would match their environment. And of course, every customer's environment is very different. So immediately I tried to think of something or some way of making it customizable to them. And so we started talking, and the end goal was that they wanted a number, either a number or a rating of, critical, high, medium, or low, assigned to every vulnerability and then in correspondence to every asset. And that's really where this came from. It was just a simple ask. And before I knew it, I started diving down, one rabbit hole after another, getting dev heavily involved because my coding, as I like to call it, is nothing more than a crayon drawing compared to their expertise. So getting them heavily involved, as quickly as possible, and starting to customize it. And, like I said, just trying to create something that isn't just for one customer, but which we do a lot in customer success, but something that's a little bit more tailored, something that we can give to every customer, and then we can kind of, tailor it to them, to their environment and their networks. And this is what we came up with.
Awesome. And, it's funny you mentioned that the client approached you in that way, because it was almost, verbatim the conversation that I was having during this proof of concept, which is that especially if we can pull information back from endpoint devices, whether that's Windows OS assets, whether that's controllers, PLC switches, doesn't matter. And so, with all the information we can gather, we can sort of more tailor our queries into the CVE database, the vulnerability database that we also publish. And that gives them sort of a more granular and more applicable list of CVEs versus just a wide open list of millions of potential entries based on the fact that, oh, you're running a system from this vendor and here's all the CVEs associated with that vendor. But even though we are able to better tune that information, it's still not, some clients still struggle with it because at the end of the day, it still can be a very long list, even if we, push aside the Windows assets, which of course are going to have a longer list because we get such granular details from BigFix taking a look at the installed updates or the updates that aren't installed. And so they do need a way to kind of contextualize all of that information and actually make sense of it and figure out what they're going to do about it, because sometimes it's not really truly actionable. And sometimes it is still just overwhelming, right? So, wow, there's all of this huge long list. What do I do with this information? And so it's really, really great that there's you've worked on and that we've incorporated this way to give them the ability to sort of sort and filter and figure out and prioritize, like, okay, what is even actionable? What are the things on this list that I need to most worry about?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was something that, I was recently at DEF CON and we had a speaker that came up and I was trying to find their name, but I hopefully by the end of this discussion, I can try to find their name. But they gave a talk on one of the elements that I added into the calculated risk rating, which is EPSS, Exploit Prediction Scoring System. And something that, kind of like as you mentioned, being able to see all of this data is one thing. It's great. But where do you start? CVSS scores and, they can kind of paint a picture of, this is, more detrimental to your environment. And then this is not. And so you can kind of, leverage it on that. But even, that discussion at DEF CON, the individual that I'm talking about is both on the EPSS board and on the CVSS board. And something that kind of differentiated between the two is that CVSS score is not meant to be necessarily actionable like that. It's not meant to be the higher the score, the more, the more resources you need to throw at it. Which I found quite fascinating because having been in the cybersecurity world for a few years, that's always been kind of the golden standard. This is where we start. And then EPSS came around and it's a different way of looking at things. It's looking at, the likelihood, like the real likelihood of an exploit being taken advantage of or being exploited, a vulnerability being exploited. And it's quite fascinating to look at this, to look at their crazy algorithm that they put together to put this information out there. And just reading up on it, I knew that this had to be a part of my CRR because, it's important to know what's actually not just at risk and not just what can be impacted, but what's the actual likelihood of this being exploited. You can have a vulnerability that is a CVSS score of 10, but if the only way to actually exploit it is with physical access and it's behind, multiple layers of security, the chances of that exponentially go down. And it can take $1 million to fix that one vulnerability, or you can spend $100,000 to make those layers harder to get to, or harder to get at. And so being able to kind of look at that and really differentiate this, that's sort of where this whole CRR is kind of aiming towards is, not just a manner of, if something were to go down, what would be the impact on company operations or on, business operations, but also where should we put resources into? Where should we focus on shifting? And I don't want to say by any means that it's an end-all be-all thing or, it's something that should be taken extremely heavily, but it definitely should be something that's talked about on the table when it comes time to push resources, to fix vulnerabilities, to push patches, and just to get a customer's environment to be more protected.
Exactly. And I mean, are you sure you weren't on listening silently on that call that I had with the client like a couple of weeks back? Because honestly, like so many of those same points came up. And they are valid concerns because, more and more, it is becoming the case that operators are, realizing that there is a need for better cybersecurity policy and practice and procedure within OT environments. And that's a very good thing. But at the same time, depending on which industry we're talking about, margins can be very thin. There's not necessarily a lot of budget. Depending on which facilities we're talking about, there's not necessarily a lot of in-house expertise available to really implement solutions. And so it really does become it really does become incredibly important to be able to identify, I use the term crown jewels. I've heard a few other cybersecurity speakers use the term as well. But like, those most critical assets that, I lose them, I lose my whole plant or I lose my whole process within the next 5 minutes versus other things where it's like, I could lose that and not notice for a week. So, being able to identify the crown jewels, being able to identify the most relevant, I'm going to use the word relevant threats, because like if the biggest concern, if the biggest, most concerning exploitable vulnerability in my controller is, well, the attacker has to be standing right next to the engineer as the engineer is doing a firmware update, and then the attacker can sideload malicious code into the controller. It's like, okay, well, A, the engineer is standing there next to the attacker. B, I have that on camera. C, somehow he got past the gate. Like other layers of security have already failed at that point. And there's a lot worse that can happen because you have a malicious actor literally standing inside your plant. Like at that point, are they actually going to even bother sideloading malicious code into a controller when they could go over there and throw that switch and drop your whole process?
Yeah.
So figuring out what your crown jewels are, figuring out what the most relevant threats that you actually need to focus on are for those crown jewels, and then figuring out how to, mitigate or address or at least partly alleviate some of those risks and vulnerabilities. Like that's hugely valuable to our clients because they don't typically have a lot of time. They don't typically have a lot of resources. They don't typically have a lot of budget to throw at this, even though they recognize that cybersecurity is really, really super important. And they don't always have a ton of support from, whoever their controls vendor is or whoever their integrator is to implement these solutions. So giving them as many tools as possible to make those determinations and those assessments and figure out a path forward that then they will find support from their vendor, from their integrator. Like that's, that's the ball game, like that's
Absolutely.
It.
And that was something that very early on, you hit the nail on the head. I think using the term crown jewels is probably a little bit more PC than what I typically say. I usually say you got to pick your favorite child. So I think, but talking with Mark Tien, who does our tech-enabled assessments, him and I were working together with several of the customers, especially the one that originally the CRR idea came from. And as we were going through things, we had to put together an idea of, how do we want to standardize this? How do we, yes, there is these important assets and yes, et cetera. But I think anybody can agree if you're at a specific site, no matter where that site is in the overall grand scheme of things, because it's within your purview, that is the most critical site, period. And so we had to take a look, a very logical look at an upper level of kind of looking down at all these sites, and we had to figure out ways of saying, okay, well, say for example, you're in manufacturing. This particular site has a higher, gross output than this other site, so it's, going to be more critical to us. And so that's kind of where we started. Was we have to decide the impact down to the asset level. And so we started with the big one, let's break down all of your sites and then let's kind of categorize those. Let's, pick the crown jewels, pick your favorite child, figure out, your top 10, figure out your top 1 and just start kind of breaking those down. And that was the cool thing too about the way that this was originally built is that, you can have 5 number 1 sites, if that makes sense. Like you can have 5 critical sites that if any one of these go down, it's going to be detrimental to our operations. Whether it's in energy, whether it's in manufacturing, water, whatever, you can start there and then kind of go, further go down things. So in manufacturing, we like to look at the assembly lines, and then for other type customers, we look at systems and breaking those out, and then finally we would look at the actual asset type. And so for example, like say a network device or say a PLC, you can give that a number essentially in 1 through 10 or 1 through 5 or whatever you want to do. And in the end, all of that can put together a number or a rating for your impact. And that's kind of where we started. Exactly like you said, you got to pick your crown jewels. You got to figure out what's important to your entire organization, and then kind of go from a macro to a micro level of okay, well, now that we're in this site, what's your most important line? If you're pushing out XYZ products, is X the most critical? Okay, well then let's give that a higher rating. And so we started these discussions with a lot of our customers, and it's really created a lot of really awesome dialogue, because now they're looking at things like if emergency response type stuff were to happen, if this site were to get hit by a hurricane, or this site would be hit by a tornado, or whatever, what would we do? And it's created a lot of really awesome dialogue, both for me as customer success, but also internally, where they've put together policies and stuff based on this, which to me, I never expected that. That was really cool to see.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's very cool just seeing what you can all do with this. Once you pick your impact, then we start putting together the likelihood. So, a lot of our viewers, I'm sure, when you start dealing in terms of cybersecurity risk, the algorithm, as it's so called, is likelihood times impact. So we look at the impact, and then we got to put together the likelihood. So that's where I start putting in things like I mentioned, the EPSS, which I think the likelihood is it's always an educated guess, right? In my opinion, because it's you can take a lot of factors. You can look at your history. You can look at what people are actively exploiting things in the wild, or if you're a water company and another water company gets hit, you can use your threat intelligence to get an idea of, okay, this is the vulnerability that was used. We need to go in. We need to fix that. Or, it's a little bit of an educated guess, because you never really know exactly where they're going to hit. You have to block 100 doorways and all they need is one.
Yeah.
So, when it comes to the likelihood of an attack, it gets kind of froggy, if you will, but that's kind of been the big thing that we've been focusing on. A lot of my customers have been adding different things to the likelihood now. I actually just completed that today, where we're looking at things like connectivity. So if a site is connected, a lot of these sites are air-gapped, but if they have devices there that are connected to the internet, or if they are only corporate, or varying degrees of that increases the likelihood of an exploit, of a vulnerability being targeted. So likelihood's been kind of the Wild West for that, but it's something that we've added to the calculated risk rating, and so far it's been pretty cool. It gets very wild, but it's been pretty cool just implementing that. And then once a new vulnerability drops, it's kind of this mad scramble again, but it's fun. It keeps me busy.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess it's worth pointing out that there is a degree of effort that does have to go into this, because obviously each client is going to have to sit down and, especially in the case of like our deployment, because some of what you're talking about can, like the philosophy, at least of what you're talking about, can be applied regardless of what your particular inventory management solution or asset inventorying solution is. But obviously, the Verve software is, very, very well set up to deliver on this. But there is going to be some homework, because, of course, first you have to go through the process of that actual asset discovery, asset inventory. You have to figure out what's in your environment if you don't already know. Hopefully you do. Hopefully the operator already has a really good idea of what's in their environments, but we know that that's not always the case. And so once they have gone through the exercise of developing an asset inventory, then there is the additional exercise where they actually have to go through and they actually have to say, okay, well, what on here, and you talked about this, like they actually have to be able to go through and assign that criticality rating. Like, what is the impact of losing this? What is the impact of losing that? And that's not a trivial process. Like, there is some actual homework there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's not something that you can necessarily, that isn't something you can necessarily compute programmatically, because what's going to be critical in, even two facilities that ostensibly have a similar product, right? Like, two different water treatment facilities or two different bakeries or whatever the case may be, the specific pieces that are going to be like the most critical to operations aren't necessarily going to be the same 100% of the time, or from facility to facility if you're dealing with, an operator who has multiple facilities. So they do actually have to do the tabletop exercise of determining impact, determining criticality, and then the additional work of determining likelihood. And obviously we can support through all of that. Once those things are done, then do we, and this may be a loaded question, I don't know, but once we've gone through the process of actually assigning all of those things, do we now have it in our software that, like it can do the computed parts? Like, I'm looking at your blog post and I'm seeing like, the heat map, for example, and like sort of, so do we have sort of the ability then to take in those ratings and take in the impact ratings, take in the likelihood, and sort of produce that list of like, okay, well, here are your high heat, most critical?
Yeah. So, when it comes to, you're talking specifically in terms of likelihood. I think, a few software versions ago here at Verve, we started including the EPSS data. And I think, honestly, it was kind of, it wasn't like I don't want to say a big deal. Like, it was just kind of another data stream that was added. It was another field of data kind of coming into our platform. And it definitely kind of helped pave the way for a lot of this. The EPSS is put together by first.org. And I think it's the same individuals that actually created the CVSS scores. So they are way smarter than me, and they have algorithms that are far, far beyond what I could ever imagine. And they look at things like they look at is there active exploits on Metasploit or on, GitHub, or, is there actual code out there for this vulnerability? So the level of research that must go into these algorithms is just crazy. But that's always kind of served as my focal point for the likelihood, simply because, 60% of the work was essentially done for us based upon that EPSS. Now, when I was at DEF CON, I was actually listening to one of the board members. He specifically pointed out that EPSS is still trying to evaluate the OT environment specifically, because it is such a specific target, if you will. It's not a typical environment that is pushing out a lot of, hey, we were exploited. I'm sure they will to the authorities and to each other and stuff, but it's not a very heavily, you'll hear, like in Florida, the hack that happened that, messed with the water treatment facility where they had a little bit of the extra chemical going into it. You'll hear about things like that. And so these vulnerabilities will gain some level of notice, but EPSS is still very much developing this OT area of expertise, if you will. So the threat intelligence that's going into that is still like second to none, in my opinion, because it really is setting us up good in terms of the likelihood of these vulnerabilities being exploited. But now, in when I'm calling with these other customers, my version 2 of the CRR, we're adding things like, we're looking at EPSS, we're looking at the CVSS score, we're looking at connectivity, and then we're actually adding points for each of these. So say, for example, EPSS is pushed out in a percentage. Okay, so what is the likelihood of this exploit or this CVE or this vulnerability or this CVE being exploited? And sometimes it's 90%, sometimes it's 10%, and everything in between. And And then we'll give that a value based upon where it is in a percentage. So for one of my customers, anything that's above 40%, they are giving it a super high rating in my calculated risk rating of 15 or something. Like it's abnormally high because by most measures, we're using 1 through 10. So if it's got a high EPSS data, then they really want to highlight that as, this is something we want to look at fixing ASAP. And then kind of delving into that further, doing their own research and at least highlighting it, at least giving them an idea of where to start. And so far, it's done a lot of good stuff. We've had several customers now, like I said, that have done the policies. They've started pushing patches to specific areas. One of the things that I'd like to spin off of is, we mentioned before, like if there's a CVSS score of 10 for a server, a lot of companies, a lot of board members will want to push resources to that to fix it. But what they won't look at is the 90% likelihood vulnerability that's on the ID scanner for the door to the server room. Like if they utilize that vulnerability and exploit it, they can get into the server room and they can do whatever they want at that point. So is it smarter to put resources towards the server or towards the door scanner? Like it's, it kind of creates a chicken or egg scenario, but at the same time, it's a lot cheaper to fix your vulnerabilities on a door scanner than it is to go in and fix servers or fix, PLCs and have downtime and everything that kind of comes into that. It's given a lot of thought into where do we start. All that to say, yes, quite a bit goes into the likelihood and the level of customization that we add to that.
Right. And I mean, ultimately that gets back to, what we talked about kind of at the beginning of this, is that it really is about contextualizing that information, because you can give them a list of CVEs and most operators kind of realize that they're always going to have vulnerabilities in their environment.
Yeah.
Because they can't fully patch, right? Like, that's just not an option. They're not, going to be on IT type update cycles where they can cycle their hardware every 3 or 4 years, where they can push out updates to a lot of their servers and endpoints, pretty much, making sure that those endpoints are fully updated. Sometimes key production servers, maybe you can't push everything out to, but it's not the same as in like an OT environment where the vendor might qualify only a very small subset of patches for deployment. So they're always going to have vulnerabilities, and they're always going to be vulnerable. They're always going to be at least a generation, if not more, behind in terms of operating system, hardware, etc. And everybody sort of realizes this, is that the stuff that's in OT is going to be there a long time if it hasn't been there a long time already. And so in a way, you're dealing with cybersecurity problems from a decade ago or more.
Yeah.
And well, that's all well and good. But then, okay, well, all of these things are exploitable, or well, maybe not all of them are exploitable. Some of them are exploitable, which are the ones that are the most exploitable, which are the ones that, like you say, does it make sense to go in and patch all your servers and reboot all your servers against exploits that require physical presence, or does it make sense to harden your door scanner? And those are important determinations to make because, again, budget and resources and, the availability of people who can even do this work, those are all fairly rare things. And so being able to, make those determinations and say, okay, well, if we do this, then even though we're not patching out this whole family of vulnerabilities, they can be considered mitigated because, we have the fancy term that auditors often use is a compensating control, right?
Yep.
And there, done. And that's, again, like I say, it's literally this whole conversation could have been had, like the chat I was on 2 Fridays ago, because my goodness, the client had a lot of questions around exactly that. And
I think especially with compensating controls, it's always important to put in like defense in depth. I think a lot of my customers have really, like you said, they're just now kind of coming, especially a lot of my newer customers, they're just now kind of coming to the cybersecurity table, and really, they've taken it seriously and they've, put a lot of resources into it. But I think very much they've depended upon being air gapped. And now they're, I think kind of the world of OT is realizing that air gapped is awesome, but it's not an end all be all. Creating these compensating controls, creating this defense in depth strategy. It's something that has been big for a while in IT. But OT, I think, is really starting to come around to, okay, this is something that we've got to put in place yesterday, because now OT is a huge target, especially when you start talking about ransomware attackers or nation states or hacktivists or things of that nature. Anything in OT can it can be targeted by somebody like that, and they have a lot of resources, or they have a very set ideology that can really impact what even if you're if you're a water company, and all you do is put water in bottles or things of that nature. Like, there is somebody out there that's targeting that, and so just knowing where to start, that's huge.
It is. Just trying to think how I want to wrap this up, because I mean, like, you've covered it all in pretty great detail. And of course, I'll make sure that there's links to the blog post and the white paper in the show notes for those who really want to, sort of dive into it a little bit more and see all the stuff that Zach's written around this. But I guess, just to, I guess maybe, just to put a little bit of a marketing spin on this. Hi, Sally. Hi, Rick. This is sort of where all of the different teams that we have in Verve, I think, can really sort of, this is one of those ways where everything kind of just comes together, right? Because obviously we're collecting a huge amount of data from asset inventory, which then, we have either the managed services team or the customer success team. Well, the customer success team, of course, will then help with like a lot of the visualizations. The managed services team can help with the exercise of, determining impact and determining likelihood. And then, again, back to customer success, if they want to like build visualizations that, showcase this to the client, right? Like, okay, well, here are your top 100 like highest risk things or something like that, right? And build them a nice chart or a heat map or whatever we need to build them to, sort of to give any visualizations that they want to need. Because at some point, even when you are, even when you have your list of like, okay, well, if we do these things, like it covers off a huge chunk of our risk at not much, for not much investment of dollars or time, you're still going to have to, there's still going to be a meeting probably that has to be had. And meetings are usually best accompanied by some kind of visual. So this is kind of one of those places where all of the different teams within Verve kind of really work together to help a client out, because we're getting them the data, we're helping them contextualize the data, we're helping them represent and visualize the data, and then they can move ahead with actually implementing the solutions that are best for their environment and their budget and the time and expertise that they have on hand.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, I mean, I think another thing too that's really important about this is this sort of further bolsters something that Sally and I were talking about in the previous episode, which is that there is still sometimes, some resistance, some reticence on the part of operators to utilize solutions like Verve's, because we're a little bit more than just your classic passive scanning solution. We are a little bit more, I mean, in the case of OS-based assets, we're pushing out an agent, right? The Big Fix agent, and sometimes the Verve agent as well, if we need to position that elsewhere in the environment. And we are actually doing more data gathering off of devices, not in an agent-based way, and not in a way that pushes configuration changes back to those devices, but we are trying to pull back more information about a device than just the fact that it's sitting there on the network and who might have made it. We're trying to pull back, the hardware versions, the model numbers, firmware versions, etc., in part because all of that information that we get back, whether from the OS-based assets, whether from other assets that we're querying for data, all of that information, of course, then goes into our ability to look at CVSS, look at EPSS, look at vulnerability databases, figure out what's even in play within the environment, figure out what vulnerabilities are applicable to any particular piece of hardware that we can actually detect and inventory. And something like this, sort of that next step of gathering all the data is, I think, sort of a really, really strong argument for why it's important to overcome that hesitance to be a little bit more active, to use a solution that's a little bit more active when it comes to inventorying and starting to develop a cybersecurity solution for an OT environment. Because the richer the data you can bring in, the richer the risk mitigation strategy you can pull out of that, especially using something like calculated risk ratings. It's, it's not going to be the magic bullet of an argument, definitely, but I think it is, sort of one of those really, really strong points that is in favor of not just utilizing a purely passive solution within the environment, of actually being willing to step up and implement more active solutions of the sort that we are, because the downstream results of doing so can be incredibly valuable to the organization in terms of, informing a complete cybersecurity strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one of the things that I've been very blessed with the customer success is I love kind of being a solutions manager, if you will. Like if I see an idea, in the military, we used to like to call them good idea fairies. I unfortunately love to be a good idea fairy. And one of the things that I noticed with this, especially like as a Verve platform, since, joining Verve a few years ago, new customers, they can come in and very quickly become overwhelmed with the amount of data that they initially see. They thought they had 1,000 assets, and for every one asset they had 3 vulnerabilities. So they were like, okay, we have 1,000 assets, 3,000 vulnerabilities. And then they get in and they find out they've got like 15,000 assets and over 100,000 vulnerabilities. And so very quickly they just get overwhelmed with, oh my gosh, like where do we even begin? And this has kind of been, in my opinion, like my first step of that good idea fairy of, okay, now we can kind of wrangle these snakes. We can give you your lanes of traffic. And we've been able to identify all of your assets. We've been able to identify all of your problems. Now let's start creating a workflow of what do we do next? How do we fix this problem? Going back to your point, what compensating controls can we put in place? What can we do to patch this? Or, how can we create a defense in depth strategy? This is just, something that I think every organization can take a part of and utilize it. And it can help to really kind of put that overwhelming feeling kind of to the wayside and be like, okay, well, let's start with these critical assets that are, critical assets with critical vulnerabilities. Let's start with them. And then, once that gets down to the low hundreds or zeros or whatever term we want to set, let's start getting after it. Let's start doing it because, I know it's been kind of a big point with the OT after hours and really kind of the cybersecurity and everything is, those vulnerabilities are there. They're not going away unless you do something about it. And so, staring down the problem in the cybersecurity world is not going to fix the problem. And there are certainly hackers out there that would love to take advantage of that. So this has kind of been my first step in that. And then, hopefully we can start getting more data that can help contextualize this and can actually point customers towards do this compensating control to get rid of 15,000 vulnerabilities or right now we've got it with Big Fix and with our Verve agent of do these patches and you'll get rid of 40% of your vulnerabilities. So I think we're definitely heading in that direction, and I think this is just an awesome brick in the wall of fixing those problems.
Absolutely. Lance, you've been sitting there ever so quietly. Any thoughts before we bring this thing to a halt?
Well, this has been fantastic. I've really appreciated being a fly on the wall here, listening to this conversation. I've had some thoughts and almost instantly you've brought them up. But one of the things I've been reflecting on during this whole conversation is the trust that the company needs to put in us in order to have that conversation. Yes, this is our one most critical piece of equipment. And the honor it is to have that trust and that build that relationship with the customer, to build up this huge amount of information that can then guide really, really good decision making on where to focus your time, effort, resources, money in order to make your facility as secure and safe as possible. And it was you didn't really touch on the trust aspect, and I wanted to make sure that we recognize that it takes trust to build that relationship, and it's really an honor that we can be a part of that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a very, very good point. When we have our customers joining us, they're basically telling us their deepest, darkest secrets. So yeah, it's a very good point. Very excellent point, Lance. Just being able to have that trust put in us has been huge.
Absolutely. And I mean, really, it's a level of trust that kind of has to permeate the entire process, right? Because, we do need to be in the environment. We do need to access information within the environment, potentially confidential information, in a fairly direct way. And I mean, obviously, we take great pains to make sure that everything we do within an environment is not going to be disruptive to that environment. But it is still a very high level of confidence and trust that, has to undergird that exercise. And then again, too, with the exercise of, figuring out what risk is, making sure that, that information is good, that the guidance we're giving clients is good. They have to be able to trust that as well. They have to be able to trust the rankings that we come up with.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I think that is it for this week. You have been listening to OT After Hours, a podcast about industrial cybersecurity, why it matters, and all of the challenges that it presents. Although I guess I shouldn't say this week, because with this episode, we should be back on our monthly cadence again after the whole CrowdStrike special episode that we did a little bit ago. But regardless, please share our episodes with your friends, with your family, colleagues, and anyone else you think would be interested in industrial cybersecurity. And please consider leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast has been produced by me, Kenneth Kully. Our opening and closing music is by the ever so talented Outtro Sound. Look him up if you need some music for a podcast or a video. Thank you, Lance, and thank you, Zach.
Thank you.
Thank you. Glad to be a part of it. Thank you guys for having me.
Absolutely. And thank you out there for listening. We will talk to you soon.